Thanks everyone for joining us for this particular talk from the incredible Gillian Hayes. Gillian is the Kleist Professor of Informatics. She has appointments also in computer science and education and pediatrics at the University of California at Irvine. She currently leads the CERES initiative network with Candace Odgers and spends the rest of her time designing and evaluating technologies to support people in taking control of their health and learning data and technologies. Today's talk is really going to be about accessibility issues and what is it and why do we really need to be aware of it, engage in it, and prioritize it. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hayes.
Thank you so much, Anna Mara. So welcome everyone. I'm going to try to turn on Zoom slide share and whatnot now, which I really should have tested before we started recording this because of course it's always the biggest challenge, but I think we are good. Okay, all set there. So as Anna Mara mentioned, I have the privilege of co-directing the CERES network with her. And then of course, Dr. Riddleson runs our training programs. So for those of you that are watching this collection of lectures from CERES scholars, that's really her thought baby. So thank you for that. I will provide accessible versions of these slides that you can get distributed through the mHTI network. I'm not sure if we can link those or how that works, but certainly reach out if you would like accessible versions of these slides. And that is going to be the start of our talk, which is a lot today. I'm going to give you some things to read. I'm going to give you some things to think about in terms of accessibility, but I hope if you take nothing else from this talk, you'll take some basic things like always make your slides accessible and downloadable to people. Always turn on closed captioning when you're doing your Zoom recordings. Those kinds of basic little tiny, what we'll call practices of inclusion can make a big difference in the accessibility experience and in everyone feeling like they can be a part of whatever community you're in. You'll notice a lot of logos across the bottom of my slides. Again, good accessibility practice is to always describe what is on your slides. So in addition to the talk title, accessibility and why it matters for mHealth and my name and so on, you'll see thanks to all of the wonderful folks who support the mHealth Training Institute. Obviously, UC Irvine is my institution. The Jacobs Foundation provides the funding for CERES, and that is how we're able to support mHTI. The MDOT consortium and the NIH are the primary funders of the mHealth Training Institute, though. So thank you to all of those folks. Okay, so let's get started. On this very first slide, I'll confess, right? I'm a professor. So one of the core things about being a professor, and most of you are as well, is that we always give a reading list. If you have a meeting with me, you're going to walk out with things that you are meant to read. So I've got the images of 5 different books that I want to recommend to you if you haven't read them already. So first of all, on the top left, we have Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto. And this is just a core thing for thinking about technology and who we are. It's a sort of classic by tech standards. And in this book, Donna Haraway warns us, technology is not neutral. We're inside of what we make and it's inside of us. We're living in a world of connections and it matters which ones get made and unmade. And so I like to think about Donna Haraway's work as really laying the foundation for a lot of what we might be doing when we think about mHealth technologies and other kinds of supportive technologies, that they are not in and of themselves neutral, and they're not by definition always going to be good. We often think, oh, well, the technology is what it is and people are going to use it in whatever way they're going to use it. But there are values in all of this. And so this brings us to the next book I want to recommend to you there, Value Sensitive Design. So for those of you who know Batya Friedman at the University of Washington, really she has for many years been talking about the way in which values are fundamentally embedded in our design decisions. And they sit at the forefront of a world in which we can design with a moral imperative. And if you're here, I'm assuming that means you're interested in sort of cross-disciplinary collaborative work. You're interested in using technology to be supportive of a variety of health issues. And so you are coming into this experience with a set of values that you might impart into any design decisions that you're going to make during your time in the mHealth Training Initiative. The last three books I want to recommend to you are really more sort of disability studies specific. And I debated because there's like 10 different books I want to recommend to you. But these, I think, are a good sort of swath of thinking about how we think about disabilities and sort of spread across and so on. So the first is Disability Visibility, edited by Alice Wong. These are stories about disability told from the perspective of the people with disabilities. And so frequently, able-bodied people throughout history have told the stories of disabled people. And this is a case where you really get their voices. So if you don't read any of the rest of these, that's the one that I would encourage you to read and keep those voices and their stories in mind. I've gotten a bit borderline obsessed with poetry of late. So the next book I want to recommend to you is Beauty is a Verb, which is disability-focused poetry, largely written by disabled people. And then finally, if you're interested in sort of notions of cognitive disability, invisible disabilities, and so on, I encourage you to read Neurotribes, not just because it's interesting about autism, which is a space that I'm particularly interested in, as well as Julie Keentz, who you had another lecture from, but also because this talks from a historical perspective about the ways that people have been fighting. And you may have heard bits and pieces of people fighting about disability first language or not, about curing versus not, medical models of disability and social models and so on. And so where those kinds of fights have been laid out historically and what the future looks like in a world in which we want to celebrate a diverse set of ways of thinking. So that's your reading list to start you off. And now let's jump into the actual heart of what I want to talk to you about today. The first thing you might be asking yourself is, why accessibility? We might be talking about all kinds of other things. In any design project, you are by definition making trade-offs. You're going to be trying to decide about cost, about impact, about different kinds of resources you might have. So why should accessibility rise to the top of those considerations when you have to make those trade-offs? The first thing is just scope. Currently, in our latest estimate, 750 million people worldwide have a disability, but those numbers are a few years old, and here's what's really important about that. What we know has happened in COVID is we have created a whole bunch of disabilities. So things like long COVID, but also other impacts of COVID we will have more disabled people on a go-forward basis. So you can assume that the expectation of sort of the market size, if you will, is very, very large. Of 54 million Americans with a disability, most of them are spending a very decent amount of time online already. And again, as we're sort of rolling out the new statistics and looking at things post-COVID, there are much higher expectations of disabled people. So in the past, they might have found a way to push through the way in which, society is not structured very well for them. Now there's a feeling of, well, why shouldn't I have access to things like remote work, remote schooling, accessibility in general? Because we have shown during COVID that actually we can shut down the whole world and make it accessible. And so now people have higher expectations. And that's a theme I'll loop back to at the end of the talk. And then finally, improving accessibility improves usability for all users. Apologies, there is a typo on that slide. So we call it, you may have heard people call this the good grips model or curb cuts, but the notion is that if we improve the design for a unique population, we're going to likely improve the design for everyone. So when I talk about the good grips model, I literally mean Good Grips, the kitchenware line. They started as a company that was trying to create can openers for people with arthritis. And if you ever use the can openers from the 70s that I grew up with, the ones that would cut you and give you tetanus, and they were just awful and you had to really crunch down on your hand to get them to work, you can see why someone with arthritis would struggle with that. Well, it turns out Good Grips created a better can opener, and now you will basically never find one of those can openers that we all had. They all look like the Good Grips ones with a nice soft handle and so on, because it turns out it's better designed for everyone. Children can now open cans. People with bad hand strength like me from typing too much can now open cans and so on. And the curb cuts example that people will talk about a lot is when they put in those dips in the sidewalks to help people with wheelchairs. Guess what? It also helps people with scooters and baby carriages and a whole variety of wheeled kinds of ways that we want to get on and off the curb. And so again, improving something for accessibility actually improves for everyone. So these are just some of the reasons you should care about accessibility. But now I'm going to show you, because I think visceral, painful experiences sometimes can help, what life looks like when you use software that wasn't really built for accessibility and you use it with a screen reader. So our blind users are going to use screen readers. Here's an example. This is one of my PhD students several years ago using his inbox.
Link search, link images, mail, link drive, link calendar, link sites, link groups, account options, heading level 2. Mark Baldwin, mail by Google, folders, heading level 2. Inbox 26, link alt plus. Mark Baldwin, mail inbox.
So this is just terrible. And I just want to give you a sense of that, because this isn't as bad as it gets. I'm going to show you where it gets even worse. But all we got through in that was going from the very top of the menu structure down to the inbox. All of that time is what it took. And this was with an expert user who was clicking fairly rapidly and listening as he went and knew what the structure of the menu was.
Baldwin, mail.
Now I'm going to show you an example. Here's ones where I actually, this is my mail, and I actually click into some of the email pieces here. Okay, here we are. We're going to turn on the screen reader.
VoiceOver on Outlook, inbox bullet, asg@88.ucia.edu, window, entering Outlook inbox, bullet, asg@88.ucia, web content. You are currently on web content. To enter the web area, press Control, Option, Shift, down arrow. In web content, congratulations Kelsey, Cara, Gillian and Catherine. Such an amazing accomplishment. Horizontal separator, new link, from Calbridge to Great Allen less than, link, Calbridge Great Allen bounces, at mailman.cpp.edu, greater than on behalf of. You are Alexander L. Rudolph less than, link, Al Rudolph at cpp.edu.
This is me just clicking down through an email.
23rd, 2021, 11:15, link, to Calbridge North Scholars less than, link, Calbridge North at mailman.cpp.edu, greater than, Calbridge South.
So that's a plain text email. Let's take a look at one that has some images.
Message list table, subject, artificial intelligence and law colloquium, vertical line, IFIOMOR Jumbo vertical line 3/29/21, web content. You are currently on web content. To enter the web area, press Control, Option, Shift, in artificial intelligence and law colloquium, vertical line, IFIOMOR Jumbo vertical line 3/29/21, web content, the artificial intelligence and law colloquium. Presence. IFIOMOR Jumbo, Associate Professor of Law, UNC School of Law. You are currently on a text element inside of web link, the paradox of automation as. You are anti-bias intervention. New line. March 29th, 2021, vertical line 12:00:1:00 p.m. Link, more details. Earn SVP.
So you get the idea of what that looks like. Now let's move to the Office of Inclusive Excellence.
Subject, UCI BTI March update, sender, Office of Inclusive Excellence, 6:24 p.m. No message preview, row 4 of 626. You are currently on a table, web content. You are currently on web content. To enter the web area, press Control, Option, Shift, in web content, image.
And when we get here, it just says image. It's completely inaccessible to anyone using a screen reader. So this was a video that I made actually to help explain to the communications person in our Office of Inclusive Excellence why we shouldn't use images in our emails and instead do other kinds of things. But it gives you a sense of just what it's like to actually use screen readers on top of programs that were really built not for blind users instead. So just wanted to give you a little taste of what that's like so that when you're thinking about making your programs, you think about what this experience is like. So something that might look wonderful to someone who is sighted might actually be a really terrible experience for someone who's using a screen reader and other kinds of things, right? It's not just going to be, blindness. That's one disability, but there's lots of other kinds of disabilities we need to be thinking about. And so just kind of experiencing that a little bit can help you build a little empathy for what that experience might be like. So when you think about accessibility, you may think about sort of basic web content accessibility. This is something that there's actually legislation around, and for many years, people have really spent some time trying to make web content more accessible. Now, you just saw a set of emails Those are all accessible by our legal standards, but I think we can all agree that wasn't a very pleasant experience for us. So we can continue to do better, but it's still worth at least making sure that we're hitting the WCAG sort of general principles and so on. So these really are about providing technical specifications to improve the accessibility of our web content, our websites, and web applications across all devices and across people with a wide range of disabilities. So the WCAG folks try to include auditory, cognitive, neurological, physical, speech, and visual disabilities. And the notion behind WCAG is really these were created to help define how to make things more accessible with some kind of standard. This is the most widely accepted set of recommendations. Generally, again, this is sort of legally prescribed in many places. And the key thing that I want to make sure that you understand is that the very first version was heavily reliant on techniques for accomplishing accessibility, particularly as it related to HTML and how we would do the markup there. Subsequent versions focus more heavily on the principles of accessibility, which I just want to share with you quickly so you have a sense of what those are. Their principles are that things must be perceivable. So you have to be able to look or listen, as the case may be, and understand what is being produced for you in terms of the content. They must be operable. So you have to be able to use the technology. You must be able to engage with it in some way through whatever resources that you have. So if you're a keyboard only person or whatever the case may be, they must be understandable. You have to be able to figure out what the interface is trying to tell you, and then it must be robust. This is often about errors and recovery and so on, so you get trapped down pathways that you shouldn't be. And the thing I want to note here for you is that for those of you that are familiar with usability, these principles are actually very similar to the kinds of usability guidelines that we might have more generally, right? We want people to be able to engage with an interface, understand what's happening with it. If they make an error, be able to recover from that error and be able to translate what they're understanding from one interaction with it to subsequent interactions. Those are all standard usability guidelines. The difference with disability is going to be always thinking about that your end user might have different abilities to interface with something, might have different visual or cognitive or auditory or physical or other kinds of abilities. And so how do you make sure that something is perceivable when you have different kinds of perceptions? How do you make sure something's understandable when cognitive levels may be different, and so on? So I just want you to think about this as accessibility is not totally foreign. It's just a matter of putting present to mind that different bodies and different brains might be interacting with your technology in various ways. This is the moment where if we were in person, I would pause and ask you for any questions. So just feel free to email me if we can chat, or I'll be with you in person in July. But now let's get into a little bit more conceptual pieces here. So the first thing I want to really make a point about is that disability is fundamentally relational. The notion of disability at all is always created as a distinction from whatever the cultural idea is of normal. And so that means that fundamentally disability is always shaped by social conditions. So the social conditions that you're in the spaces you're working may have very different ideas about what it means to be able or disabled. And so that's always important to be thinking about when we imagine what the context, what the group of people is who we are calling disabled and so on. And this tends to, over historical time periods, exclude full participation in society of anyone considered atypical. And so one of the key areas post-COVID that disability activists are very interested in is this notion of people who are, for example, immunosuppressed as a category of disability. During COVID, when we were all locked down, those people suddenly had the same participation in society as everyone else. Then things got even worse when we started to come back and they were even at higher risk and so on. And now we're sort of back where we were pre-COVID. And the question is that where we should be? Is it okay that society is now excluding in many ways from full participation people who have immune differences and so on? And so you can apply that to any kind of disability, but this is a notion of how we think about society and who gets included and who gets excluded in sort of our modern worlds that we're working in. The other thing to note about disability is that it's dynamic. This is a status that changes all the time. So the image that I have here on screen is an older individual with a walker, and there's a mobility impairment there. Aging is one of the core ways that I can guarantee you every single person who is listening to this lecture right now will be disabled at some point in their life. If you live long enough, you will eventually be disabled, and it is a dynamic experience. You may also be injured. I was giving a talk on accessibility and disability a couple of years ago, and there was a woman there with a broken leg, and she said to me, I never thought about accessibility at all until I had this injury, and now I'm aware of it all the time. And so, we hope that you don't have to be injured or ill in order to experience disability, but that is something that can happen. And then, of course, there are treatments that may change your disability status. So sometimes you go from being very clearly disabled to being treated. In the case of a broken foot, the likelihood is you're going to experience full recovery and there's no evidence of disability in the future. In a more provocative and sort of questioned area right now, neurocognitive disabilities, there are some people who are treated to the point at which you can no longer detect the neurocognitive disability. There's questions about that. Similarly, cochlear implants, and whether or not there's a big fight within the deaf community about whether or not these are a good idea, you taking away some deaf identity to eventually not appear disabled any further. So there's a lot of dynamic elements. Just because you're disabled at one point in time doesn't mean you won't be at another, and so on. And you may have multiple disabilities and other kinds of factors. And then finally, context creates both our abilities and our disabilities, right? So rain makes floors slick. The picture that I have here on the left is a sign, wet floor, please be careful. We here in California have been dealing with that for the last 2 months. Lots of rain, lots of environments that were not built for the rain. So suddenly none of us can walk clearly and stably because we have slick floors. Stair railings, so that's the upper right picture there. This is a man who had posted on a DIY accessibility blog about stair railings are great for low vision walkers and people with mobility challenges and so on. But in the particular case he was posting about, you'll notice in the picture, for those of you that are able to see it, the stair railing is metal. And so in that particular case, it was a very hot day, and suddenly you can't use the stair railing anymore because someone put a metal stair railing in a place that gets a lot of sun. So the context of that day and that moment changes who is abled and who is disabled. And then finally, I like to put on the bottom right there the example of making a choice of going on the elevator or the stairs. These are really complex and dynamic decision-making processes. Am I going to take the stairs today? Am I going to take the escalator? This might make a difference. What's happening with the escalator? Do I have anxiety about escalators, a particular kind of disability? Do I have a movement impairment that makes going up and down the stairs difficult? What are the crowds doing? Other kinds of things. So even something as simple as an architectural plan that puts an escalator and stairs right next to each other. And you'll note in this particular picture, again, for those who can see, no elevator anywhere near. So am I looking around now for an elevator that may be somewhere else? But all of those architectural decisions actually have accessibility impacts, and they're very, very highly context dependent on any particular day for any particular body. So that gets us to this notion of how visible a disability is. And if you talk to me in person, I talk a lot about visibility as it relates to accessibility, because I think this is a really important sort of somewhat overlooked kind of notion. But visibility is not an attribute one with a disability has, but rather a spectrum on which somebody with a disability might move across. And so how visible a disability is, so how detectable by other people it is really dynamic. And the levels of visibility wind up being quite nuanced and overlapping. And so if you've ever, had a conversation with someone where they might relate to you, well, I have some kind of cognitive disability or anxiety or ADHD, autism and so on, and you didn't know prior. It's a really good example of an invisible disability. And many, many, many highly successful people have invisible disabilities, and the stigma that's related to being someone who is disabled means they've often hidden them for a very, very long time. And so people don't necessarily understand when someone has a disability and when they don't. And I wrote a paper years ago with two of my PhD students, Heather Fawcett and Kate Ringland, on this notion of invisibility and disability. And we talk a lot in that paper. I won't get into the details here, but if you want to read more, you can, about the visibility of the disability to other people. So how do I detect that I know or see that you have a disability or not? And the visibility of the assistive tech to other people. So suddenly, if I can see your hearing aid or not, I might think different things about your hearing ability. If I can see that you're wearing glasses versus wearing contacts, because those are sort of fundamental assistive technologies many of us use, that's going to help me think about, again, whether or not you actually are disabled in some way, and what does that mean? Well, let me run down some of the issues that we get into here. There are a lot of issues with disability, right? It's stigmatized. People may not believe you're disabled. Often we have this come up where students might be asking for accommodations in a class, or a patient might be asking for some special accommodation for the clinic, and there may be a disbelief about why that person is making that request. Minimization, this is the sort of, oh, but you're doing so well, it must not be really a problem for you. Denial, concerns about legitimacy, how legitimate is the request that someone's making, or their disability needs, the usability, and so on, and then support from technology and other people. Well, it turns out that the exact same list is the list when we talk about issues with assistive technologies. So assistive technologies and their use can be stigmatizing. Maybe if I'm using AirPods, which is what a lot of people with hearing disabilities use now, it just looks like I'm a cool person who's listening to my iPod or my iPhone. I'm doing my thing with my AirPods. If I have a hearing aid, maybe that's more stigmatized. How much we believe people really need that technology or not. For many years, I worked with autistic adults who were looking to work in a variety of jobs. And one of the things we worked on teaching them to do is use their smartphones as assistive technology to help them with executive functioning and other kinds of support. Well, if their manager didn't believe that and said, well, no, I told you to put your phone in your locker, you're not allowed to have it out on the floor or wherever they may be working, we start to have a problem. So again, engagement with the technologies, the disbelief, the minimization of your need, denial of services, how usable is a piece of technology, and so on. So it's the same set of issues when we think about disability as with assistive technologies, just two sides of the same coin. But one of the things we really looked at when we started to think about these things is this notion that devices become signifiers of disability. So I want you to think about that as you're developing your mHealth technologies or any educational technologies. How does the use of this technology signify that I am either recovering from an illness, getting support for some health concern, if it's a mental health concern in particular? How are the devices becoming signifiers? And I love to use this picture because this woman wrote a very long blog post about people harassing her whenever she pulled into the disabled parking, and she looks able-bodied by all notions, and people would come and confront her, and they think they're doing the right thing, like, hey, you're not disabled, why are you taking this disability space? But actually it's really problematic. And so she made this little whiteboard sign, yes, this is my handicap permit, no, it's not your right to know why. And she would actually wave the sign at people and so on. But what we see, right, is that devices that wind up threatening identity are abandoned in some way. And so actually disability hang tags in the car is a good example of this. People who either don't want to see themselves as disabled will stop using them, or people who don't want to get into this argument that this young woman is getting into on a regular basis, they'll stop using them. So anything that says this is threatening to my identity wind up being abandoned. At the flip side to that, devices that look like assistive tech and can wind up empowering people and helping legitimate what their concern is. So again, you don't get that hang tag unless someone somewhere has approved that you are disabled. And so it can be empowering depending on who you are and the kinds of conversations you're having. So these are just important things to think about. There's no right or wrong answers here, but as you're designing, you want to think about the way in which devices can signify some kind of authority, some kind of disability, some kind of legitimate thing. And so in the terms of visibility, what I like people to think about here is, what does it mean when you are possibly not visible to your assistive technology? And so this comes up a lot, again, with health monitoring technologies and so on. If they don't sort of understand how to interpret the signals they're getting, because they're all built around a quote unquote normal body, and you have something different, then the technology isn't able to see you correctly. You're not visible in the way that you need. And what does it mean also when your technology doesn't believe you need help? So if you have a particular kind of disability, you may need your technology trained in a particular way. But again, we're often training these technologies on sort of a broad range of normal, and there might be something different. You see this with assistive pets, where they're trained very, very clearly to detect a seizure in a particular person or detect anxiety in someone else. A pet is much, much smarter than most of our assistive technologies in this way. And so where can we go from this to start to have the technologies really believe when you need help? And then the last thing is, again, what happens when the technology outs you as having a disability? Maybe you don't want people to know that, but something about the assistive tech that you've been provided is showing to other people that you might have some kind of disability. My favorite story about this from my own life is when I was in my early 20s, I had to, for a little while, wear a remote heart monitor. And at that time, they were absolutely hilarious. They sort of stuck pods on you like an EKG. And then you had this box that was a little bit bigger than a deck of cards that you would strap to your side. And at the end of the day, each day, you would download this information through that sort of a fax machine sounding terrible phone line. And I was out at a baseball game with my heart monitor on under my clothes. I thought it wasn't visible at all. Someone came and asked me for a cigarette. And I said, well, I don't smoke, sorry. And he got quite angry with me and was like, I can see your cigarettes right there. At which point I realized he could see the outline of the heart monitor underneath my dress. And so I had to explain to this man that I don't know, who's getting a little bit belligerent with me actually in a baseball game, that no, I don't smoke, and that's a heart monitor, and I promise I'm telling the truth. And he didn't really believe me, and on it goes. And so now I've got this weird situation where I'm in a very awkward social conversation with someone because the technology that I was using for health monitoring outed what I had going on. So really important to make sure that all of our technology is visible, is seeing us as humans, as people in need, knowing that our status might be changing and dynamic. And so the tech has to adapt and change alongside. And the IoT devices have to be trained on us as we are in those moments. And we know that technology increasingly can detect things that perhaps we didn't even know. So how do we make sure that we're being smart about all of that? I've got a little graphic for you that helps sort of think about the visibility of devices and the visibility of the disability. So along the horizontal axis here, we have the invisibility versus visibility of a disability, and on the vertical axis, the device's visibility. So in this upper quadrant here, we have things like an iPad that is teaching kids how to speak or helping them speak if they're nonverbal, or a Google Glass device that we created in my lab that was focused on helping support people to moderate their way of speaking. These are largely for people who have invisible disabilities. You may not be aware upon first looking at someone that they may have communication difficulties, but the device is quite visible. Down here in this lower quadrant, we have people with invisible disabilities and invisible devices. So increasingly, hearing aids are becoming less and less visible. Pacemakers are a great example of something that's so invisible, it's innate inside your heart, and you have to actually declare it, for example, when you go through airport security, so that you don't have problems and so on. And then the other quadrants here: visible devices, visible disabilities. A cane for a blind user is probably one of our most common examples. It's fairly visible when someone is blind, and their cane makes them even more visible. Increasingly, we're seeing the devices become less and less visible when we have amputees. So our bottom right example here is a woman who has a prosthetic arm. And you'd have to look very closely at this picture right at her elbow to really be able to see where the prosthetic is. So the devices are becoming less and less visible. But if she were to remove that prosthetic arm, her disability would be highly visible fairly quickly. And then this picture here in the sort of middle of this is a project from many years ago where we were working with Microsoft on a tool they had at the time called the SenseCam. The idea behind this was that anyone would use it. It wasn't necessarily built for people with disabilities, but we found that it was incredibly useful for people with autism and ADHD and helping record what was happening in their lives on a daily basis. And so we start to make visible to a degree the disability through the use of these kinds of tools and so on. This is an example of sort of how you can be thinking about these. Again, there's no right or wrong answers to where we sit in this quadrant, but there are questions that can always be asked about how visible we are making things and whether that matters. And then I'll just throw on the big question mark is most of the work that I'm doing these days, they're all smartwatch devices, they're chatbots and other kinds of things that were built for not for accessible technologies. We're suddenly using them as accessibility. Where are they going to sit in these kinds of thoughts? How visible are we going to make things? How stigmatized do uses of these technologies become, or do they stay sort of the cool thing that everyone's doing? Okay, this is again where I would stop you for questions, but instead we're just going to plow through. So I sort of think of the pillars. I gave you the WCAG's 4 principles of how they think about assistive technologies and accessibility. I'm going to move you to the sort of 5 pillars that I think of, and I put up here ed tech and mHealth. Many of you are not ed tech people, but I think these apply to both, and so I want to kind of have you thinking about how these fit across them. So listening to the folks and their lived experiences, flexibility, creativity, collaboration, and then finally the last one, which is really learning from where we've been, and that's going to take us full circle to the COVID remarks that I opened with. So first of all, listening. Sorry to anyone in the room who's been a K-12 teacher or the clinicians, the MDs, the nurses in the room and so on. But what we know is that classically educators and clinicians don't always listen to the kids and the patients and other folks because they're very, very well trained in their clinical thinking and their pedagogical training and other kinds of places. Increasingly, what we're seeing is all of those folks are starting to really understand that the kids we teach, the patients in our clinics and so on, they know a lot more than we think. Whether that's because those folks are getting more savvy or we're just understanding how to work with them better, I don't know. But we know that when it comes to disabilities, a lot of it is about just the individual experience of this body, of this brain that we're working with. And they may often know themselves well enough to understand, well, I need a break, or I need to sit on a bouncy ball during class, or I really need to eat a little bit differently than what's been prescribed to me, or whatever the case may be. And formal meetings tend to be really difficult contexts for creative problem solving. So I want to encourage you all to think about beyond the sort of formal patient conference, beyond the sort of formal meeting that you might have to go over someone's health plan, what are the ways that you can listen to their ideas and their problem solving outside of those structures in places they may feel more safe and able to hear, you may be able to hear them and they may be able to hear you, and you can trust each other a little bit more. The second pillar really is about flexibility. And so the picture here in the background is a project called the Tangible Desktop, done by one of my former PhD students, Mark Baldwin. And this was all about addressing that email issue that I showed you at the beginning with the screen readers, as well as other kinds of things where the graphical interfaces that we all are used to using on our devices just don't work well with screen readers and so on. But what he did there was a lot of 3D printing and sort of DIY kinds of things. And so making it so that the end user can assemble what works for them. Is it going to be some tangible interfaces? Is it going to be keyboard only, or does it need to be a sound conversational interface, and so on. And so that way, if we have that kind of flexibility and we use lots of different modalities and we allow people to customize, everyone can win, because even people without a diagnosed disability, they often have individual preferences. They know how to engage with their own health data or with their own learning, and they want to be able to do those things. And increasingly, especially now that we have adaptive interfaces that can build on AI and so on, you can take advantage of those. So I really want to encourage you to think about, how do you bring in multiple modalities and this kind of customization to be flexible within your projects this summer? The next thing is about creativity. So this picture in the background here is a workshop with teachers to really think about how we're going to balance our safety concerns. We were doing this work in schools. The same is true in hospitals and other kinds of clinics. There's an understandable impulse to make sure that everything is safe, everything is got the right security modes on it, that we're meeting the legal standards for accessibility and so on. But fundamentally, we sometimes can then struggle with the kinds of innovation that we want to do. And so for many of you, you'll know the notion of Pasteur's quadrant, where we want to innovate in the places that have the most impact and help us develop new scientific models and ways of thinking. And that is in this space of being safe and creative at once. Collaboration. The particular image that's in the background here is from one of Jason Yip's projects where he was co-designing with children. But the notion here is that we are always collaborative partners with the patients, the families, the children, the other folks in our studies. And so I think it's really important, though, that it's not just that these folks are brought into our studies. They should be. We need to privilege their lived experience, but also it's really important that we create diverse organizations and design teams. So when you get broken into your teams, if you don't have anyone with disabilities, you don't have anyone with chronic health conditions, you don't have anyone that has some of those lived experiences, think about what that means. Now, we formed your teams. There's nothing you can do about it, but I want you to think about where you were limited then because you don't have those folks. And if you do have them, I want you to, or if you yourself are someone with a disability, I want you to think about how you can contribute and why it matters that you are present in our organizations, because until we truly have diversity and representation at all levels of our organizations, we're not going to create truly inclusive designs. And then finally, this last piece about learning. There's no turning back from what we've seen. We know that the pandemic made us make profound changes to the way that we live. We just saw a moment where a ton of accommodations were made for the whole planet almost overnight. And so what I want more than anything is for all of you, when you think about accessible technology, I want you to think as broadly as you did during the early days of COVID. So if we have a child or a patient with social anxiety and they don't want to come into the clinic or they don't want to come to school, what are we going to do? How are we going to make it so that they can participate fully in society? Are there technological solutions that we can use to allow for remote monitoring, telemedicine, mobile health kinds of solutions that help us to deal with that situation? Or if someone gets sick, or if someone gets injured, how are we going to make sure they can fully participate in society no matter what? And we know that there's ways to do this. We've shown that we can do it. So now it's really a question of if we have a sort of societal and institutional will to decide that we are truly going to make all of our new mobile health technologies that we're creating accessible and accommodate everyone, that we're going to really make healthcare truly inclusive and make all of this accessible. So I like to give you assignments for going out, make small changes now, make structural changes when you can. Some of you may still feel like you're too junior to be empowered to make true structural changes. So remember this in the future. Use your privilege. You're all here, which means you're awesome, because I saw the applications of the people we admitted and the ones that we weren't able to accommodate, and you're all really impressive. Listen to the kids. Kids are so creative. I love to do my research with kids because they come up with really amazing solutions. And we as a community can make a choice to recognize and promote inclusion and access for all. And kids generally tend to take that position. So enjoy. I hope you have a great time thinking through all of these things. And if you ever want to talk accessibility, let me know. Thank you so much.